Okay, so a very good morning and welcome on this misty day in Gloucestershire. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world. I hope you're fit and well. I'm in fine fettle. This is my my fifth consecutive day of training. I've got a large glass of water to make sure I can my voice will keep going for the time that we're together. As you can see on the screen, we're going to be considering the compliance aspect today, specifically for those of you who undertake the role of SMF16, the compliance director role or the compliance manager role within your firm. So we're very much going to be looking at that today. Just let some more stragglers in. Good stuff. Right there with us now. Okay, so in terms of what we're actually going to be covering today, let me just run you through the learning objectives. So by the end of this session, we'll have refreshed your memory, I'm sure, for the majority of people on the call on what the oversight responsibilities are for this particular role. We'll look at the key elements of the role, including something called the statements of responsibility. I'm going to share with you an annual compliance calendar and give you some suggestions and thought starters on what you might want to include in that from a best practice point of view. We'll talk a little bit about what the FCA might be expecting, particularly around how your business is structured, relevant to kind of size and their expectations with regard to turnover, that kind of thing. Building on that, we're going to be looking at, is there a need within your business to have a risk committee, compliance committee? What does that actually need to look like? A quick overview of some of the internal audit requirements that you might consider. And I know a lot of you would work in partnership with IFAC in that perspective. And then also have a quick look at what the FCA's process for accreditation of SMF16 is and what support is available to you from IFAC again in that regard. So that's kind of the flight plan, if you like, in terms of what we're going to cover. I'm going to start off by admitting two more people. There we go. Start off by just refreshing our memories about why we have SMF16 roles, where this has all come from. All goes back to the senior managers and certification regime. It's been out a while now, since 2019, and I think we're all getting much more kind of comfortable with it in terms of the expectations on our good selves. As you know, this was something that initially came out and was applicable to the bigger providers, so banks, building societies, insurers, and then it was cascaded down into our advisory sector. In summary, what is this trying to achieve? It's all about strengthening individual accountability, and that's why this role, this SMF16 role, you are individually accountable and you're actually approved by the FCA. And I guess for me, this is about them being able to just reach through from their from FCA towers to say, okay, so who's the individuals who are responsible and accountable within a firm? Let's have a clear line of sight into them. And I guess for those of us who undertake this type of role, at least it gives us a very clearer allocation of responsibilities, what we're actually on the hook for in terms of fulfilling this particular role. And it does mean that senior individuals who are approved and are accountable in this regime are just that. So the FCA will come a looking in terms of sanctions if you were to fall foul. Okay, so I'll just repeat it. Whoever's not on mute there, if you could just mute for the benefit of the rest of the group. Thank you. It's put the onus onto firms to be responsible for the fact that the people within the firm are fit and proper, and introduced this concept of the annual fit and proper test, competency check. I kind of like it to an MOT that you need to have on an annual basis. So now the onus squarely rests at our door, and obviously the SMF16 plays a big part in that. And the overarching kind of aim of this regime was to improve standards across the board. I mean, that's kind of one of the key requirements of this, what the FCA are all about. As part of this regime, it's introduced 6 senior management functions. For those of you like me who've been in the industry sometimes, you remember the approved persons regime. It kind of built on that and beefed it up in the way that I've just talked about. And as part of that, it did introduce these 6 specific roles. As you can see, there are 4 in the governing functions, but the 2 required functions are SMF16, that's the focus of today, which is all about compliance oversight, and SMF17, the MLRO requirements, and that's the subject of next week's workshop. In terms of fulfilling one of these SMF functions, then what the FCA have said is that every role must have something called a statement of responsibilities. And this does what it says on the tin, really. It just says, this is what the role is, this is what the role is responsible for, these are the accountabilities of the role. Now, it doesn't need to be war and peace, it can be quite a crisp document. There's lots of examples. In fact, if you're that way inclined, you can go onto the FCA website. It's actually, in this regard, quite good in terms of giving you the expectations that they have. There's also some excellent material on the IFAC BAT system, and talk to IFAC in the normal way if you need any help with that. It also talks to something called a duty of responsibility. And the bottom line for that is that, you know, if for whatever reason, firm or individual is found to breach the compliance requirements that they're responsible for, then they can be held accountable. It acknowledges that. And it also lays down, it's almost like a job description in terms of core responsibilities, specific responsibilities that this senior management role is actually holding. Now, as you know, those of you who've worked with me before I ran my own business, I actually worked for the Nationwide Building Society, which is as big as one of the high street banks. So this is kind of the senior management function regime, as you know, was rolled out several years before. I was the head of training at Nationwide, and I was given prescribed responsibilities under the senior management function to be responsible for the training and competence of 12,000 of the branch-based staff. So that's how it works, and I was held on account for that. And actually, part of my bonus entitlement was predicated on successfully delivering those objectives, and a third of it was held back each year in case anything fell foul. So in the corporate sector, these things have been alive and well for a while, have been taken very seriously. It's newer, although it's started to become embedded here. But basically, as I said in my opening comments, this is about the FCA having a clear line of sight, making sure that individuals who step up into these type of roles are very clear about what's expected of them and what their key responsibilities are, and signed to acknowledge that they will take accountability wherever required. And will be sanctioned if need be, which I guess if you were writing this from a regulatory perspective is exactly where you want to be. So, as I said, it is a required function. So all core firms need to have an SMF16 to fulfill the role of compliance officer. And as you'd expect, it does what it says on the tin. It carries regulated responsibility across the firm. For those of you, we've all got different business structures. We could be, growing our businesses to the extent that we have to take on more than one role and wear more than one hat, and that's acknowledged by the FCA. They're not saying you have to recruit somebody specifically to do the SMF16 role. Now, some of the larger businesses on the call may well have somebody sitting in that role, and that's their full-time activity. I'm sure there'll be other businesses where it is done, I'm going to say, on a part-time basis. That's not to kind of decry the importance of the role and the responsibilities that are attached to it. It's just that, you know, a bit like me, I'm kind of a one-man band. I've got a couple of associates who work with me and some PA support. Therefore, I have to wear more than one hat. Yeah. Today I'm at the sharp end doing training. This afternoon I'm preparing for a meeting with my accountant, so I'll assume the finance director role, and that's something that you're very familiar with in this sector, wearing different hats as required. The thing with this role is, if the business is big enough, it would report into the board, certainly would report into the management structure about the FCA's the firm's compliance with the FCA rules and regulations, and making sure that everything is as it should be there. We talked about that statement of responsibilities, and therefore what are those responsibilities, the key responsibilities. As you may well expect, first and foremost, it is about protecting the firm and keeping them safe, and not doing that in a passive way, not waiting for things to go wrong and then reacting. This is about proactivity. Or when you read some of the FCA's documentation, that message comes through loud and clear. This is about prevention, not cure, proactivity. And that's why I'll be sharing things like a compliance calendar and talking to you about how that might be quite helpful. It's about demonstrating that you're applying the appropriate systems and controls. And I guess for this, it's horses for courses. Again, this is why it can't be a one size fits all. It needs to be totally relevant to the structure and size of your business. You are expected to have some sort of oversight of compliance, and that's why I'm going to give you some suggestions for the things that might be included in a compliance calendar. I'm not claiming this is my own work. This is some excellent material, again, available from IFAC, that if you don't use it already, will help you construct and use a compliance calendar. And building on that point about proactivity, it's about doing everything that's reasonably expected of you in this role to prevent a breach occurring of the rules, you know, across the relevant handbooks. And as I say, when you step forward and undertake this role, then you are approved by the FCA and you are an accountable individual by the FCA. So if the wheel does come off the bike, it is you that will come looking for. And if you want some clarification reading, I suggest that you again plug into their website, and there is some guidance around this and the potential action that they could take with regards to sanctions. Could be against you as an individual or the firm, or indeed both. What it does do helpfully though in there, it defines reasonable actions. Okay.
Oi, bom dia, tudo bem?
Nuns, you're on the phone. That's disrespectful to everybody else on the call. So it defines, you know, what reasonable actions are, and it builds on that point about taking reasonable steps to prevent the breach. So it's just all about saying, right, familiarize yourself. If you're taking everything that a third party looking at that would say, well, that was reasonable. Actually, at least you were proactive. You tried to prevent it. The sanctions obviously going to be less. And if you sat back, put your feet up on the desk, and weren't seen to be proactive, trying to do something about it. Again, in the statement of responsibilities, it will be based on the structure and firm. but in some way, shape or form, you need to take responsibility for defining the overall risk framework, the risk appetite of the firm. And again, depending on your business structure, it doesn't need to be war and peace. It could be 200 to 500 words in terms of what your appetite for risk is and how you're going to manage risk within the overall framework. And importantly, this is a point that some advisors that I work with miss. They've done something and they think this is great, but you have to proactively show that you are developing it and maintaining it. It's just not something that's frozen in stone. It will also say that you should be taking a firm-wide view of compliance risk, and I'd probably extend it wider than that and say you should be taking a marketplace view of risk and looking at what's coming down the track, such as customer duty, for example. You've got overall responsibility for the compliance function, and within that, typically what tends to happen, the SMF16 is responsible for the complaints management process as well. Not always, but typically that seems to be where it lives. And also making sure that you're complying with the second element of the senior managers regime, that certification regime, that annual fit and proper test for your approved person. So making sure that your advisors are fit and proper to trade. And of course, there's a big piece about reporting back into the firm and making sure that you're reporting as you need to be back through Gabriel into the FCA to show that you're on top of all your compliance responsibilities. So as I just said, really, the secret, I think, to this role and to the understanding of this role is to be able to demonstrate, if required, that you are proactive and you're taking an active interest. And as I said, my provocation was to go wider than solely the firm. You should think of yourself almost as a proactive individual who's looking at marketplace and industry developments. And the good news is the FCA very helpfully provides something that can help you with this. And you can download this and keep it on file and you can react to it. And I know this is something that IFAC can help you with too. A lot of you in the call probably already do this and are aware of it. So apologies if I'm kind of teaching Granny how to suck eggs here. But for those of you who aren't aware of it, every 6 months, the FCA produce this document that's called a Regulatory Initiatives Grid. There's a screenshot of it. Just use your search engine and you'll be able to find it. And very helpfully, what that does, it sets out their plans for the regulatory framework and initiatives on a rolling 2-year basis. And every 6 months, they'll update it and publish it for free, which is great because in your role as SMF16, it helps you understand and plan for potential regulatory change. It was started as a pilot exercise, but it's still continuing. So it's been going for a couple of years now. Now, at first glance, again, this is just a screenshot out of the paper. At first glance, if you just give it a cursory glance, you think, well, it's a bit too high level, isn't it, Jeremy? I don't really think it'll affect me sitting down here in the advisory space, in IFA land. And a lot of it, to be fair, it is very high level. But as professionals, we should have a view as to what's coming down that might kind of affect our industry. But if you take the time to dip down into it, guess what? Every time I look at my emails at the moment, or pick up one of the pink papers or talk to my clients, there's a building momentum around consumer duty and what the expectation is going to be on us later on in this year. Well, as you can see there, I've actually highlighted that was in the initiative grid going right back to November last year. That actually gave us first sight of it and said there'd be a consultation paper, so we could start to get our heads around it and we could start to prepare for that, because we need to be proactive and start to think through what what does that mean for us from a compliance perspective within the business? How will that impact our systems? How will that impact our processes? What changes might we need to make in order to demonstrate that we're fulfilling our duties? Now, again, I know this is something that the IFAC are looking at on your behalf as members, and I'm sure there'll be further news about this as we get closer. But my provocation to you as a professional who's fulfilling the SMF16 role is you need to take this on board as well yourself, and that would be great to have as evidence, if required, that you're actually being proactively looking at developments. I also said when we were talking about statements of responsibility that it's a really good idea to have a compliance calendar, because you know what it's like. You know, I'm like you. I run my own business. We have peaks, and we have even higher peaks. I'm still waiting for, you know, a trough to kick in. And what happens is that things that are on your to-do list, I don't know if this kind of resonates with you, kind of slip and slide and things move to the bottom. And sometimes, because you're in the moment dealing with a client or an issue or a provider, some of the compliance type activities there might be a temptation for them to fall by the wayside. By having a compliance calendar in place, sharing that across the firm and having planned activities, rather than having to do everything in a big chunk, it helps you break it down into bite-sized pieces and actually get it done throughout the 12 calendar months that you need to work on it. So from that point of view, in terms of workload management, in terms of being able to deal with the inevitable clashes of priorities in the business, I heartily recommend the use of a compliance calendar. Again, this doesn't need to be anything fancy. This is not about trying to make work. This is about trying to save work and make things simple. So a simple spreadsheet or a simple Word document, just broken down into those areas I've suggested there. And what sort of thing would you put on this? Well, you'll know better than me because you're the sharp end. The sorts of things I could think of is, you know, you have to get your Gabriel returns into the FCA. You know that we've got the consumer duty coming in. I'd be penciling that into my compliance calendar to say we need to get ready for that. For those of you who are structured in that way and have board meetings, you know, I'd have that in, and, you know, regular updates from the SMF16 into board. I'd have any sort of further requirements from senior management and certification regime requirements. The classic example there would be your annual accreditation, annual fit and proper for your advisors, but there are a myriad of other things I'm sure that you can think of. You'd also, I guess, to extend it, could put things in there like your marketing promotions. You've got to get your marketing signed off and approved. You'd have kind of when you're going to review your different processes. You know, when you're going to have a look at that process over here, when you're going to look at that other one over there, so that you can have a plan of attack. And again, when you're going to pencil in your training. So I noticed, I was looking back in my diary for last year, doing some planning for this year. I noticed we went through this sequence of compliance type training activities last year with IFAC. So that looks like it's a cyclical, it's an annual process. So you could be putting that kind of training activity into your compliance calendar as well, and anything else that you do within your business. So that's kind of how you would help fulfill some of the responsibilities that you have as an SMF16 to demonstrate that you're taking your responsibilities seriously and that you're being proactive. In terms of what the FCA expectations are from governance, they expect to see some sort of structure in place. And what they'll do is they'll compare your business to other businesses Yeah, so they'll look at the sizes of your organisation in terms of turnover, marketplace, and expect your structure to be similar in some way, shape, or form. So what you might want to do is get a structure chart together. Yeah. For some of the bigger businesses, this is probably second nature. For those of us who've worked in a corporate environment before we came into the advisory space, again, these are things that are just bread and butter. For those of you who probably haven't pulled one together yet, it's actually a good idea. It's a good discipline to pull a structure chart together. It can be a little bit harder than you think, but it's a good exercise, particularly for those of us like myself who have to wear multiple hats. And you can see the different kind of roles, responsibilities you need to undertake, and who's the accountable kind of director or senior manager within the business for the different responsibilities. And it's also a good thing to share across for the larger businesses with the staff, so that they know who's responsible for what and who the go-to is. Where you've got a business of around about £1 million, then the FCA are relatively happy that it's a CEO type of business. Okay, good. Somebody's policed themselves. Good. There's no hard and fast rules. You can't go onto the FCA website and find that figure. It's just kind of a rule of thumb. Where you get beyond the kind of £1 million turnover, I would suggest a need for you to look at separating out some of the different functionality. So this is where you might want to have separate accountabilities and responsibilities for compliance, maybe finance or ops. Possibly you might even want to consider, a NED coming in as a chairman to start to bring some independent challenge to your business. And that's a role I fulfill with 3 or 4 businesses. I come in as an independent exec, and as you can tell, would be quite challenging with a small c, with a view to making the business as efficient and effective as possible and delivering great consumer outcomes. Stakeholders like to see this, clients like to see that a business is well structured, because it's about safety and security and expectation management, really. I don't know if any of you are large enough to have external shareholders, but certainly there's an expectation from external shareholders that there'll be good governance in place. So none of that is compulsory. It's just me sort of suggesting with you that as your business kind of evolves and grows, then your business structures and governance need to mature likewise. So one of the things we said is when your business gets beyond the kind of £1 million turnover, you might want to start to think about risk and compliance committees. Again, no actual rules. We can't take you to the FCA website and share with you what their thinking is. I'm sure it's a conversation you can have with IFAC in terms of the benefit of belonging to a network like this is they deal with many different business structures and can share best practice throughout the members. But when you're going over £1 million, as I said, you're expecting to see these committees. They can be combined, and no problem with that. But once you get into over £20 million, the suggestion is, from a best practice point of view, that you really ought to be thinking about separation of these committees. I'm sure you know this as well as I do, but just as a refresher, what does a risk committee do? Well, basically, they're looking at the appetite for risk. So what are the parameters of risk we want to work within? And some businesses have actually articulated that by way of a risk framework. And basically, the committee will set the objectives, will set the targets for compliance to work to. And you can think about some of the KPIs that a risk committee typically might want to be interested in. That would be things like complaints, about treatment of vulnerable customers and identification, about compliance with TCF, standard of work, you know, on advice quality, that kind of thing. So you could create your own dashboard at the risk committee that is cascaded down to the business, and then you could be inspecting that on a monthly or quarterly basis. Regardless of what you do at the risk committee, when you look in the FCA handbook, SISC 21, Systems and Controls, says every firm does need a risk register. Even if you're a one-man band or one-person band, you need to have a risk register. As I say, it needn't be war and peace. It doesn't have to be anything over-engineered. It's just defining a risk appetite for the business. Even if you just got a statement, it is required. If you're a firm, and I know some of you may be on the call, that's got DFM permissions, then just be aware, I'm sure you are, you need to add this into your ICAP statement, and that needs to be available publicly. I'm sure you all know that. In terms of compliance committees, then, you know, what you'd expect to do is have a picture of what's been going on, and very similarly to the risk committee, you'll be monitoring performance against KPIs. Yeah, so there might be some overlap there, but there might be some ways in which you want to focus and tailor. And what you could do with a compliance committee, you could kind of in some way mimic the approach of the FCA, in terms of you could decide to do your own thematic review. So, you know, if you're in, for example, the pensions transfer market, as a compliance committee, you might want to drill down and have a good look at that. You know, you might just choose some areas to do that. My provocation to you is, if you are not running a compliance committee and you sit in the SMF16 role, don't let yourself off the hook. Think about that kind of good practice governance and structure you might want to bring into your business, and do your own kind of thematic review. And what you're doing is it's trend analysis. For those of you, again, who've worked in bigger businesses, in the corporate sector, trend analysis is a way of life, really. So we don't panic and react. We look at building a picture over a reasonable period of time in terms of what might be happening within the business based on the suite of MI that we're using. So what are the outcomes for the advisory process? What is actually happening? And you can measure performance against targets, you know, and just an example here, you know, if you are there charging a client a servicing fee, one would argue that they're paying for a service there. Therefore, what a compliance committee could do is to take an interest in that. And again, if 80% of the clients must be seen, in other words, to be able to justify your fee. If not, kind of, why not? Is there any evidence of, if a client hasn't been seen, switching off the fees, or is it just seen as a money tree that can be shaken? In terms of internal audits, it's expected that you, as an SMF16, you'll be doing some sort of internal audit every year to make sure everything is on track. And remember, going back to that compliance calendar, you could structure this in such a way you don't end up spending the month of December trying to comply. And all you've got to do is you've got to evidence for the satisfaction, I say in the first instance, IFAC, if you're buying that kind of service in from them, that everything is as it should be. But secondly, would you withstand the scrutiny of the FCA if they came in and had a look at what you were doing? And you have to be cognizant that it needs to cover every tier within the business. So you can't just focus an internal audit on the management structure or your advisors. It needs to go across the whole business, because you know, the customer, the client journey is predicated on going across the business. And you need to be able to demonstrate, and I know that a lot of you have these processes baked in, but this is the audit of them. So how can you demonstrate you're fully compliant with TCF? How can you demonstrate you're getting consistent client outcomes? How can you demonstrate you've got processes and systems in place for identifying vulnerable clients, for flagging them and dealing with them in a different way? Yeah. So this is the case of wearing a different hat as an SMF16. This is wearing your auditor's hat to say, right, I might well have put these systems in place, but I've got to be very disciplined with myself now and go in and actually audit them. Yeah. And we all know when we've built something that there might be some elements that aren't as strong as others. When I'm auditing my own business, I always think my first reaction is, well, wouldn't be so keen for somebody to do a drains up and have a proper look. What it will do, hopefully, or what it should do, is when you do an audit, it should highlight some risks, it should highlight potential training needs. And that's not a bad thing, that is a good thing, and that's what's expected of an audit. Yeah, every time I ran my piece of business back in the corporate sector, we were regularly audited. I knew I was going to get an action plan to-do list as a result of that. That's just how it is. Yeah, it is always possible to find something, and that's not a bad thing. There's a great phrase we use in the development world that says you don't have to be ill to get better. So it could be building on the strength, not just developing an area that's weak. Certainly, an internal audit would expect a drains up on the complaints process to make sure that everything is as it should be there, that you're handling things within the required timeframes, that you're not shoddy in meeting that 8-week deadline. For all the reasons we talked about, for those of you who are on the call with me, when we went through that complaints handling piece, and we know that some of the fines that can be meted out if we fall foul of the complaints process. Yeah, so we need to make sure we're all over that. Similarly with anti-money laundering, so this again is a required role. It could be a role that's separate to yours, that's the SMF16. Where I see this working well in businesses, it's a partnership. There's no reason why you can't be an SMF16 and 17. But anyway, that process will need to be looked at from the internal audit point of view. And from a compliance point of view, it's critical that everybody knows who the money laundering officer is and what happens if they're not around, if they're on holiday, who's the deputy, that kind of thing. Again, for those of you who were looking at GDPR with me the other week, I know you've had a session on cyber security as well. And an internal audit from a compliance point of view would take a forensic look at data protection, key critical these days. We talked about last week, the ICO can really hit you with some big fines. Are you sure from a compliance perspective that everything is as it should be in the data protection world? When's the last time you handled a request for personal data? Have you had any changeover of personnel in the meantime? Would they understand what to do? What about security of data? Yeah, is the password protocols live and well? Yeah, what about unauthorized access? Do people know what to do if there's a breach of data? In terms of relevant conversations, are people clear what should be recorded, when it should be recorded, how it should be recorded, where it should be recorded? Are you a firm that puts everything on the file? Do you have a separate system? Yeah. Not as prevalent as it used to be, but there's still some gifts, some corporate hospitality or use of training facilities. Is everybody clear, particularly in the advisory space, what the processes are for recording gifts and for the record keeping of that? In terms of power of attorney or trustees, make sure that as SMF16 you're aware of that. Look at the process, do a file check, what process was followed. If you're not fulfilling that at the moment and you were asked to do that, could you switch that on? And be cognizant of what the focus points of the FCA are. Operate on the basis, if you're SMF16, that although they haven't got round to you yet, one day they might come a looking. Yeah. So what are the the key areas that they're interested in at the minute. Again, for those of you who've been on one of the workshops in the last few weeks, we talked a lot, didn't we, about vulnerable clients, and that remains a key area of focus for them. Yeah, and you can see that when you start to do your reading for consumer duty, how a lot of the thinking around vulnerable clients is starting to get embedded into that. They're also, as you know, very concerned about DB transfers in particular. So be cognizant of that and make sure if you choose to be in that market, everything is absolutely as it needs to be. And they are equally concerned about off-panel processes as well. You'd be expected to, as a result of an audit, maybe tweak or change the process and to check in on understanding of individuals who are expected to use these processes. So where you make some amends to processes, you need to have an audit trail of this is the amendment, this is how it's explained, this is how the understanding was checked. Yeah, this is where you need to a certain extent put your trainer hat on to say, right, I can't just change something without, just tell somebody it's done. I need to check. It's my responsibility. This is the difference. You're in a senior position, an accountable individual. It's your responsibility within the firm to make sure everybody understands what's expected of them. And to cover yourself from an accountability point of view, you have to evidence that they understand what it is that's happening. If you've got assistant clients, I know from time to time we do deal with them. I know some of you probably choose not to deal with assistant clients, and that's your prerogative, absolutely. If you do, what's your process? How do you sign that off? How do you demonstrate you haven't crossed the line and actually moved into the advice space and was an assistant client, and they are aware of the lack of protection that comes with that? For those of you who use centralized investment or retirement propositions, revisited them, you make sure that they're still fit for purpose. What are your requirements from a compliance perspective in terms of record keeping and filing? And also, for those of you who need to adhere to MiFID, when, how, what's required, is all of that kind of, things like CAS, is all of that where it needs to be. So nothing new there. I'm very conscious of that. Certainly for some of the bigger businesses, that will probably be baked into your processes. For those of you who, like me, who run smaller businesses, it's just yet another one of those. It's sort of like a price to trade in this marketplace. It's a sunk cost investment in business. It doesn't need to take up mountains of time, but the more we're proactive, have a compliance calendar, understand what's expected of us, the more we can chunk it down and get it done in bite-sized chunks. So, in terms of a compliance monitoring program, what that would look like from an SMF16 point of view is to be able to demonstrate to people, or to the regulator in particular, that there's effective supervision in place. Yeah. Again, totally dependent on the size of your business and maturity of your advisors. If you're in the recruitment phase at the moment, obviously your T&C requirements will be more onerous on the supervisors as we move them through to CAS. What about having appropriate resources? And that's not always just about money, it's about people, it's about capacity. Having the right systems and controls, having suitability, having the right business model. That just led me to do a little bit of research, actually. Again, I went into the BAT system provided to you by IFAC, and I found this wonderful document which actually helps you with your compliance monitoring, and it's a template that actually makes suggestions. Now, you don't have to, I would suggest, slavishly follow the template, but rather than start with a blank sheet of paper, it actually just gives you a starter for 10. So, you know, go onto your batch system in the normal way, go into the compliance section, you can find it there. But this just gives you an example of what a compliance monitoring system might look like. You know, so it talks to supervision, it talks to who's responsible for it, and it talks to the frequency. So it just says, this is what it is. These are the this is how we're going to do that. This is who's ultimately responsible for it, and this is when it's going to happen. And for those of you who are big enough, that compliance monitoring activity, I'd be feeding that back up into the compliance committee on a regular basis, so they can keep track and have it traffic lighted and have reports on it. For smaller businesses, it could be something that you just have planned out so that you know in a particular month what you've got to do. So in terms of SMF accreditation, certain things that you need to do. Now, I know that some of you will already be accredited as SMF16s, and that's fine. There might be some people on the course who are stepping into that role for the very first time. So in order to be accredited as an SMF16, what needs to happen? Well, the first thing is that you need to attend the relevant training course. So congratulations, first step, you're on it. There's an SM and CR financial exam on, again, the BAT system. It's in the T&C section. You'll find it there. I was on that yesterday afternoon. And then there's something that you need to do, because as I said, this is a role that needs to be approved by the FCA. So you actually have to make an application to the FCA. Now, the FCA application is not for the faint-hearted. And I went onto their website again this morning just to check if anything had changed. It hasn't. So it's quite an onerous process to go to be approved into by the FCA. They ask a lot. When I was an approved person back in the corporate world, I had to go, actually, it was in the Canary Wharf, I know they've moved now, I had to actually have an interview because I was ultimately responsible for 24,000 people's learning and development. So they wanted to get the cut of my jib, so to speak. They don't necessarily want to interview everybody, and you'd be unlucky if that happened to you, but just have that in mind. That's how importantly they view approved persons, and they do reserve the right to call for interview. Nevertheless, there's something that is called the Form A, which some of you may be familiar with. I know the guys and girls from IFAC will be familiar with that, and I know one of the things they offer is help with getting you accredited as an SMF16, particularly helping you wade through. It's not called a long Form A by accident. It is a very long Form A. They'd also expect to see, I talked earlier about that statement of responsibilities. So, this is what you are actually responsible for, accountable for. This is what you're on the hook for. They'll also expect to see a copy of your CV, an organisational chart, some sort of skills analysis, and what learning and development you've had and where you are on your learning and development journey. So actually, that's it in a headline view. I'm just going to go under the bonnet on each of those for you. So say long Form A, going to make sure everything is completed fully. Where necessary, there's some additional information pages. You just need to have a look at that to get. You can go to their website and click and get a copy of that. So statements of responsibilities, as I already talked about that, critical that goes to the FCA, so they understand when they reach through exactly what it is that you're responsible for. And of course, when they're looking at it at the other end, they'll know and understand what they think you should be responsible for. So you need to make sure it's thorough enough. In terms of your CV, for some people maybe who've been working in an advisory space and are now stepping into an SMF16 role, could be a while since you've done your CV. So, you know, you need to refresh your CV. Your CV should definitely demonstrate why you have got the knowledge, skills and experience to step in to this SMF16 role, which in the perception of the FCA is a senior role. It's a senior function within the business and carries that sort of weight. So, you know, the CV must kind of support that. And you must have the organisational chart. As I say, it needn't be overly complex. It would be totally dependent on the size of your business. But irrespective, they would expect to see some sort of org chart, and not just kind of names in boxes. You need to make it clear who's doing what and what the reporting lines might actually look like, so that them looking at it from cold get a clear understanding of the structure of your business and who's responsible for what. Yeah, the fact that some of you may have multiple roles, that's absolutely fine. The other thing, and some people are a bit reticent about this particular aspect, because they've got a perception that, you know, they need to be ready baked to go into to the role. But, you know, if you think about it, that's not always possible. If you've got a bigger business where you've got a compliance team and somebody is now stepping up into the SMF16 role, so taking on the kind of top job, you'd expect them to have some potential gaps. They may be an expert in compliance for the area they were responsible for. They might have some skills gaps. So remember, one of the principles of the FCA is openness, honesty, transparency. So you need to do some sort of gap analysis, because the FCA are quite realistic. They're saying, look, we don't expect somebody to be totally ready baked for these roles. Yeah, it may be that there's some gaps in skills that are required for the role, and you need to do something about it. So in my world, that would be a training needs analysis linked to role requirements, and then a little plan pulled together about how you're going to close those gaps. If you are joining a business and you're coming into the SMF role, then it would be, in addition to that, I would suggest that the FCA would be very keen to see your induction program, which is specific to the individual. So it would have, you know, Joe blogs. This is the background, the CV. This is all the people they're meeting around the business in terms of their induction. This is why. Yeah. This is how it crosses over. Their induction program actually moves into some sort of learning and development plan. Yeah, which again, typically based on that skills audit, typically based on what's been seen on the CV, is right. So post-induction, this is what we're going to do to fully bring the individual into the business, or this is somebody who's currently enrolled and they're still going to do some additional training. Yeah, so a learning and development plan is required. Then I'd expect to see some sort of competency assessment. So if you think about this, we don't just hopefully push people into roles. There's been some sort of selection process. So we all know what the requirements of an SMF16 are. If we're going into the external marketplace, we actually need to articulate those by way of advertising the role, and then we do some sort of assessment of individuals against a competency framework that sits within our business. I would suggest that even for internal recruitment activity, you would have some sort of assessment of being able to take on the challenges of the role. So again, the FCA would expect to see that. And I'd expect to see that all kind of documented. So here's the plan, here's the gap analysis, this is the competency assessment that we used. Okay, so what we have done there is we have covered quite a lot of ground. I know for the vast majority of you on the call, it's probably a refresher. For those of you who are new to the role, hopefully you find that useful. Just going to pedal back over the learning objectives just to make sure we can tick them off. So in the first instance, I said we need to know the oversight responsibilities required of an SMF16. I think we can kind of tick that off. We know where it's come from and why. The key elements of the role, we talked a lot about the statement of responsibilities, and we talked about you being the accountable individual in that role. We looked at what an annual compliance calendar might look like and came out with some best practice suggestions. And as a reminder, you know, doesn't need to be War and Peace, and look at the resources around you from IFAC to support you. We then talked a little bit about what the FCA might be expecting in terms of structures and governance, and we said that's predicated really on the structure of your business. Kind of once you get beyond 20 mils worth of turnover, then they're really looking for you to separate out risk and compliance committees. Yeah. Nevertheless, sole traders still need to have a risk statement, and we said that didn't be, again, onerous, could be 200 to 500 words. Yeah. So we then moved on to say, okay, so key part of the SMF16 role is this proactivity piece. We talked about things like the regulatory initiative grid, and also said that we could use a compliance monitoring program to make sure we're fulfilling all our internal audit requirements. So rather than it being a peak of activity one particular month, we can structure that. And we shared a lot of thoughts there in terms of what may constitute an area that needs to be scrutinised by way of internal audit. And we also said it's no bad thing that actions flow from that, but it's your role as the accountable individual to make sure that any changes are understood and you've evidenced that understanding. And then lastly, just for the last 5 minutes or so, for those of you who are already accredited, congratulations. For those of you who need to go through the accreditation process, I know it looks very onerous. It is something that you may want a little bit of support with, and I know that the IFAC can help you with that. But them's the rules, folks. If you know, the FCA take this really seriously, and therefore they're committed to vetting and checking in that particular way. So covered a lot of ground together this morning. For those of you who would like one, I know from the people on the call, lots of people who asked me for these training certificates. I'd be delighted to supply those. I'm just pausing here for you to either screenshot that or to take a photograph of it. I will endeavour, if at all possible, to get those back to you before close of business today, so that you can get them filed. Okay. So with that in mind, I would say if anybody's got any questions, I'm going to stop sharing now. This is the time. If you've not got any questions, I would wish you a very good rest of the day. Enjoy the weekend. The weather is set fair, so we might be able to get outside and enjoy a bit of sunshine. And for those of you on next week's SMF17, I shall look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, thank you very much, and good morning.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Cheers for now, Baron. Cheers.